There is a man standing at the edge of the Piraeus harbor. He watches a ship unload grain from Egypt, enough wheat to feed 10,000 people. He helped arrange that shipment. He negotiated the contracts, absorbed the risk, sailed the routes that citizens refused to touch. And yet, in the eyes of Athens, he is nobody. He cannot vote. He cannot own the land beneath his feet. He pays his tax and he disappears into the crowd. This is classical Athens, the city that invented democracy, and it ran on a hierarchy so precise, so deeply engineered, that a man's entire life, his legal rights, his military role, his social worth, could be calculated in bushels of grain. Before there was democracy, there was the land. And before the land, there was the question that every Athenian society was organized to answer: how much do you produce? Around 594 BC, a lawmaker named Solon drew a line. He divided Athenian citizens into four classes, not by birth alone, but by agricultural output. The measure was the medimnos, a unit of dry grain, roughly 52 liters. One medimnos. That was the atom of Athenian status. At the top sat the pentakosio medimnoi. The name means 500 measure men. To belong to this class, your estate had to produce at least 500 medimnoi of grain, or its equivalent in olive oil or wine, every single year. These were the wealthiest landowners in Attica, and they alone could hold the highest offices of state. Below them, the hippes, the knight class, 300 medimnoi per year. The threshold was not arbitrary. 300 medimnoi was precisely the amount required to feed and maintain a warhorse. Your rank in society was literally the cost of your animal. The third class, the zeugitai, needed 200 medimnoi annually. These were the hoplite farmers, the backbone of the Athenian army. A hoplite is a citizen soldier who provides his own armor and fights in the heavy infantry line. To be a zeugitai was to be self-sufficient enough to buy a bronze breastplate and a spear. And then, at the bottom of the citizen ladder, the Thetes. They owned little or no land. They produced almost nothing measurable. Under Solon's original system, they could not hold political office. They were citizens of Athens, who Athens had not yet decided to count. 75 to 80% of ancient Greeks depended on agriculture for survival. The land was not just wealth, it was identity. And in Athens, you could not truly be a man without it. But here is what most people miss about classical Athens. The city's most prestigious class, the landowners, looked down on trade, on craftwork, on commerce of any kind. The philosopher Xenophon wrote around 360 BC that farming was the noblest occupation. Trade and manufacturing, he said, were benotic, a Greek word meaning degrading, fit only for those who worked for someone else's profit. This was not a fringe opinion. It was the operating system of Athenian social values, and it created one of the most extraordinary economic openings in the ancient world. If wealthy citizens refused to engage in trade, someone had to. You are a metic in the Piraeus. You are not Athenian-born. You have come from Corinth or Miletus or somewhere along the Aegean coast. You have settled in Athens. You pay an annual tax called the metoikion, 12 drachmas a year for a man, 6 for a woman. It is a registration fee, a declaration of your permanent foreignness. You cannot own land in Attica. You cannot vote. You cannot speak in the assembly. But you can trade. You can manufacture. You can lend money. You can build a workshop and move goods through the busiest port in the Greek world. The Piraeus, by the 5th century BC, handled trade routes reaching Egypt, the Black Sea, and Sicily. Athens exported silver, olive oil, and pottery. It imported grain, timber, and metals. The harbor was not just a port. It was the engine of an empire's commercial life, and it ran largely on the labor of people with no political voice inside it. 1 drachma, That was a skilled laborer's daily wage in classical Athens. One drachma could buy roughly 6 kilograms of wheat. It was enough to survive. It was not enough to rise. For the free laborer at the bottom of the citizen economy, every day was a calculation. Food, rent, tools. There was no mechanism for accumulation. There was only the next day's wage and the arithmetic of not quite enough. Above the laborers but below the great landowners sat the artisans, the potters, the metalworkers, the sculptors, the shipwrights. These men produced the goods that made Athens famous across the Mediterranean. Their pottery filled graves from Spain to Persia, and yet Athenian ideology placed them just above the Thetes in social esteem, skilled, necessary, and slightly embarrassing. The merchants, the emporoi, occupied a strange middle zone. An emporus is a long-distance trader, someone who moves goods between ports, absorbing the risk of sea travel, piracy, and market fluctuation. Some emporoi became genuinely wealthy, but wealth without land was not prestige in Athens, it was just money. And then there were the slaves. 1 in every 3 people in classical Athens was enslaved. Pause on that. The city that produced democracy, that wrote philosophy, that built the Parthenon, 1/3 of its population had no legal existence at all. Roughly 80,000 to 100,000 enslaved people in a total population of 250,000 to 300,000. They worked in homes as domestic servants. They worked as craftsmen in workshops. Some were educated and served as secretaries or tutors. But the most brutal use of enslaved labor was underground. The silver mines at Laurion, south of Athens, employed somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 enslaved workers at their peak. They worked in shafts sometimes less than a meter high. They breathed silver dust. They did not emerge. In 483 BC, the mines at Laurion produced a windfall. 100 talents of silver. 1 talent equaled 6,000 drachmas. 100 talents was 600,000 drachmas, a number almost impossible to make real. A man named Themistocles stood before the Athenian assembly and made a proposal. The city had been distributing mine surpluses directly to citizens, a kind of annual dividend, free money. Themistocles said, "Stop, build ships instead. 200 warships. The Persian threat is coming and we have one chance to meet it at sea." The assembly voted yes. Those 100 talents drawn from the sweat and suffering of 10,000 enslaved men became the Athenian navy. And that navy, 3 years later, won the Battle of Salamis and changed the course of Western civilization. This is the arithmetic of ancient power. The suffering at the bottom funds the glory at the top. And the glory gets remembered. The suffering does not. At the very peak of the Athenian wealth pyramid stood figures like Callias, a man estimated to hold a personal fortune of 200 talents. 200 times 6,000 drachmas, 1,200,000 drachmas. In a world where a laborer earned 1 drachma a day, this was not wealth. It was a different category of existence. The wealthiest Athenians were expected to perform what were called liturgies, not prayers, but public financial obligations. The most demanding was the trierarchy, the duty to personally fund a warship for 1 year. 1 talent, 6,000 drachmas, from your private estate, spent equipping and crewing a trireme for the city. It was simultaneously a burden and an honor. You paid, and in return, Athens acknowledged you as someone worth asking. The trierarchy was the price of belonging to the very top of the ladder. The Delian League changed the arithmetic of Athenian power in the 5th century BC. Athens had organized roughly 150 allied city-states into a defensive coalition against Persia. Each ally paid tribute, 400 to 600 talents per year, flowing into Athenian coffers. That money built the Parthenon. It paid soldiers. It funded the festivals and the courts and the grain subsidies that kept the Thetes fed and politically compliant. Democracy, in Athens, was not free. It was purchased with silver from enslaved hands and tribute from subject cities. And yet, within this system, extraordinary things happened. A man named Passion started as an enslaved person. He worked in a banking house and demonstrated such extraordinary competence that he was eventually freed. Then he built his own banking operation. By the time he died, Passion had amassed a fortune of 60 talents, 360,000 drachmas. The Athenians, recognizing what he had contributed to the city, granted him citizenship. A man who began without legal personhood ended as an Athenian. His story is not proof that the system was just. It is proof that the system had cracks, and that some people, through exceptional skill and circumstance, could move through them. The Solonian classes were not frozen. A Zogatai farmer who expanded his holdings moved up. A Penacosio-Medimnoi family that lost its land slid down. Drought, debt, war, these were the forces that reshuffled the ladder every generation. And citizenship itself, the most valuable status in Athens, was guarded carefully. After Pericles narrowed the rules in 451 BC, both parents had to be Athenian citizens to confer citizenship on a child. The ladder had a gate at its base. What emerges, if you look at Athens from the bottom up rather than the top down, is not a democracy. It is a tiered republic where political participation was rationed by agricultural output, where commerce was practiced by those excluded from the land, and where the most essential labor was performed by people who did not legally exist. The Thetes, those lowest citizens, eventually won fuller political rights not through legislation but through oars. They rowed the triremes that won Salamis. They were indispensable to the navy Themistocles built. The body that earns its citizenship through labor is the oldest arc in democratic history. We return to the harbor. The man who arranged the grain shipment watches it unload. He will not be invited to the symposium tonight. He will not speak in the assembly. He carries no voting stone, but his network built this city's food supply. His credit kept the granaries full. His risk paid for bread that Athenians ate without ever knowing his name. Ancient Athens did not separate economics from politics. It fused them deliberately, precisely, at every layer of society. Your bushels determined your rights. Your rights determined your obligations. Your obligations sustained a city that celebrated freedom while resting entirely on those who had none. That is the architecture of Athenian democracy, not the speeches, not the marble, the ladder, and the hands that held it up from below.